Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Free Soda. Alrighty, today we're gonna be talking about some cool things, but before we get to that, let's introduce our podcast members. I am Harold Lundberg, your host, one of, and sitting to my left, I have
Samuel Mitchell, an additional host.
and right over on my right here, we have the
Matthew John.
legendary, the
Matthew
mythical, the magical and mysterious.
Do I go now? Matthew Johnson.
So today we're going to be talking about books, and specifically the books that we read in high school. Most of us here actually read these books, surprisingly, so we do have a lot to say, and we're going to talk about some themes that are reoccurring in them and how they affected kind of our educational experience as teenagers and young adults. Harold, do you have anything else to say about our opening topic?
Yeah, I think we're also going to talk about sort of the role of, or hopefully, the role of, a regimented reading list in high school and what that means, and just sort of how reading books affects our overall education and maturity and what reading books does for you, and yeah, so a lot of things like that. All right, we're gonna crack it off with any specific book? Yeah, Matthew.
I think we should dive right into it with Of Mice and Men, which is a book a lot of us encounter in the earlier years of high school. And
it's an absolute classic.
Yeah, and the late years of middle school. And it's an absolute classic. Now that's a terminology that will probably come up a lot during our discussion. But just like kind of the idea of something being a classic and then that warranting its place in an educational setting. So what do you think actually makes that book a classic?
Well, I'd say undisputably the ending is, probably the most iconic part of the book. Even before I read the book, everyone would say, "Oh, the ending's so sad. The ending made me cry, et cetera, et cetera," because it's very effective.
The criminal is the benefactor.
Wrong book. But sure. I think the book does best in the ending and the build up to the ending. And I think we could talk about why the ending is so effective and really tugs at the heartstrings.
Yeah, I should say, actually, fair warning that we are going to be talking about these books in their entirety. So if you're not a fan of spoilers, that's something you might want to consider.
Big spoiler warning, because he has to look at the flowers, but we can talk about that actually. I think that one of the reasons that book shines in kind of an educational setting is because of how they treat character development and they lead you into the ending. It's like this giant game of flying a kite, basically, where they give and take. It's a let some string out and then pull taut to actually get it to lift off and get in the air. And when we actually approach the ending and these characters that we've kind of grown a connection with are forced in this like very dire situation where he has to, I'm not even sure if he could, I would say that he has a choice whether he takes Lenny's life or not, but it's that choice that kind of defines the book and defines our characters, even though Lenny doesn't have the opportunity to make the choice. And I think that that's why there's definitely this dynamic of power that comes with brotherhood and the power of kind of, I don't want to say ability, but maybe knowledge. I don't know if you want to build off that, Harold.
Yeah, no, I was actually, while you're saying that, I was realizing that, especially with these classics, which, I mean, we'll get into that later, but there's often sort of the one big reveal or the one big thing. And I think Of Mice and Men is just particularly such a good book, like all around, that we kind of forget that, what happens in the book besides, that one moment, that one decision. And, those few poetic lines near the end. I think, I often forget that there's like a lot of plot. And in fact, one thing that I remember really well from my freshman year class when we read that was we spent about half, maybe a third to half of the time we spent looking at the book at all. We spent looking at the very first passages, the very intro to the book. and about how like it starts off with this very sort of uh, um, focus on like the natural world, the beauty in nature, and looking back after reading the book, it seemed like a really weird introduction. Um, so I think it's important to remember that these classics, these books, they're not just that one moment, that one pivotal scene. It's the they're classics because they're so great in their entirety. Matthew, anything to add?
Yeah, I think. I mean, if I may, I also wanted to ask about Of Mice and Men specifically. Did we want to talk about how the book compares to the movie? Because that's always a topic a lot of people bring up in conversation about, some of their favorite books, some of the classic books, is how well does the movie emulate the book, and does it do it justice? And did either of you see the movie too, Of Mice and Men?
I think I saw a couple of the scenes. But not the whole thing. I think that's a good question. But I think there's a similar question of like I think it's just as easy, or rather difficult, to compare Of Mice and Men to the movie, of the book to the movie, as it is to compare Of Mice and Men as a great classic to Harry Potter, and like a great classic. So I think
Sure.
I think without getting too deep into like what constitutes a good movie, or can a movie be better than the book it's based on, I think we need to dive more into what makes a good story, what makes a good character, and because I think that's something that I actually have struggled with a lot with the books that we've read in high school. I think I often find it really hard to empathize. I think sympathy is a lot easier, to sympathize with the characters we read, but it was often pretty difficult for me individually to empathize with these characters because of the positions they were in and who they were as people. So I think,
Right.
yeah, let's explore that question of like, is that an important feature of books that we read in high school, that they emulate the transitional period of being in high school?
Well, actually, can I make one last comment about Of Mice and Men before we head
Yeah,
off
of
on that
course.
little
Yeah.
bit of a tangent? I'm pretty familiar with the film, and I think that how it differs from the book is that the book was made in the 1930s something, and it's Steinbeck, so it's more of a character exploration than it is an actual commentary on society. And I think that the film, which was made all the way in 1992, is more of an exploration of how Lenny functions in society, because one of the first things we learn is that he's kind of this, he's the trope of a gentle giant, and it's more about not it's more about in the film about how Lenny's inability to distinguish between good and evil, to know how to tend the rabbits, that actually makes him alienated from the world around him. And in the book, it's more of a focus on how these two close friends need to make a decision about one basically taking the life of the other. It's more about choices and humanity than it is about comparing people and seeing how they fit into society as a whole. So I think that in actually looking at the book that we read as high schoolers, it's more consumable for someone in freshman or sophomore year, in that age, to more just address these people as human beings than actually examine how they function in society, which is more under the lines of the novella that we read in junior and senior year, like Great Gatsby, which is more of a social commentary on almost nationalism, Americanism, all that stuff that we see in the film of Mice and Men.
So do you think that that's the natural development of reading these characters, of exploring these stories, of is to explore characters as individuals and then move on to more larger themes?
I do. I think that it's hard to juxtapose a human or a person with society until you have a bit more life experience under your belt. I know, at least for me, when I was going into freshman year, I still didn't really get a lot of things. I didn't understand race, gender, class enough to actually look at a human and look how they function, and the mechanism that is America, I should say, than who they are as a human.
Well, your comment about how books are fundamentally like driven by character development. Made me think about like, could I come up with a counterexample and play devil's advocate? Like, where would there be a book where that isn't necessarily true? And I think it is for the most part. The examples I was trying to think of that jumped to mind is like, would there be a science fiction book where we're creating this a utopian or dystopian fictional world is more important than character development? And the obvious science fiction book we've read that was actually in eighth grade, so I guess it wasn't a high school book technically, was Brave New World. That was in preparation for high school, I think. And that's, I don't know if we want to quickly add that to the list of things to talk about, but I would say that's a good example of that was, I was trying to think, would that be an example of where the world was a big part of the book, but at the same time, I think you're right that it still is, character development that really drives the story, because it's about John the Savage and how he interacts with this brave new world, as the title suggests.
Yeah, and to your point, I think that that's true. But even just like looking back in my high school experience in the later years in English classrooms where we talk about books that we read when we were little, or in middle school, a lot of people mention Brave New World and they're like, "Oh my God, that book was so messed up. I didn't really get it back then." But that book is blank.
Yeah, I was going to say
I'm
that
not going to
too.
say it because I don't have the energy to censor myself in post. Regardless, continue, Harold.
No, yeah,
heard
I
you.
was going to pick up on that too, because I think I think over the question of like, you need to read books at a certain time in your life. I think that that's really true, and I think that A Brave New World is a perfect example of that, at least for me, because I definitely think that I didn't get as much out of it because I was too immature at the time that I read it. Yeah, I remember thinking similarly. I think I remember when I was in third grade, all of my friends were reading the um, uh, the Hunger Games series in third
Mhm.
grade, and I thought, and I tried to read it a little bit, and I just like I made the decision. I was just like, this is I'm too young for this. Like I didn't, it was too violent to, and not to say that the Hunger Games series is necessarily on par with um, Of Mice and Men and a Great Big Gatsby or anything like that. But I think I do think that depending on your age and your um, intellectual as well as sort of um, social maturity it plays a big role in your in what you get out of what you read.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think a lot of times books are selected, the first priorities to choose which books are read when, based on your vocabulary and how well at that age level you can understand the book. You're not going to approach an advanced book and give that to a first grader, but an example of like maybe where books are given to people at a certain age to give them a certain message is Lord of the Flies. Um, I never read it. I'm familiar with it because it's one of those books I've heard of that like people read, but I feel like I've heard of how that book has been used to send a message to like middle schoolers of like, this is why, you know, I don't know, people, that seems like the age where maybe you want to like be considering, compassion and working together sort of thing, because it's an example of when you're left to your own devices, when you're becoming an adult, behaving as an adult is important. And that book is an extreme example of that.
Yeah, so you're kind of bringing in that theme of novella acting as propaganda, which it is, in my opinion, at least. But for students and children, I mean, for Lord of the Flies, I am familiar with the novel, and that's it. I mean, it would strike fear in you for most children. So I think that definitely observing the books we read and the literature we read in school as propaganda is another interesting angle to kind of address the books that are kind of all across America that always come up in a high school setting and a middle school setting, because they are aspects of the building blocks that we use to craft our character as we grow up.
Yeah, I think although I think that can be a little dangerous isn't quite the right word, but I think propaganda can sort of be a subjective term, because I think all books have you can draw a lesson from any good book, and it can be different depending on who you are, and you can totally miss the point or like and so I think that's you can have a very personal relationship with a character with a story. That's sort of what I'm getting at. But um, so I think that's something that I really don't know the answer to is do we want to read these classics to get these sort of life lessons and to sort of experience life through other characters' eyes, or should we be afraid that we're all learning sort of the same we're all learning the same things and having the same sort of experience. I mean, I'm generally not sure. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Matthew, do you have an angle for that?
Could you repeat the question? Like you're asking.
No,
yeah, run it back again.
Yeah, it's just I think I went on a bit there. I think so. Like, to give you a specific example,
Sure.
The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, I think, is a fantastic book, and it has there's a great lesson to be learned there. And in fact, I think it's a book that it's really important to read at the right age, and it's also really important to revisit later in life. I can imagine myself reading it every few years, actually, but specifically, there's this one moment on the raft with Jim, where Huckleberry is concerned, and he's there's this one great quote, which I'm not sure I can remember exactly, but where he doesn't know what the quote right thing to do is, in the sense that is the right thing to do what society is telling him to do, with turn Jim in as an escaped slave, or is the right thing to do to help his friend, and so he's very confused over this concept of right.
Right.
So I think, and so for me personally, I think that that's a great lesson to learn at that age. But I also think that, is there a danger? This is a real devil's advocate. I think that is there a danger in having everyone learn that lesson in the exact same way? Everyone that I've interacted with at school has learned that lesson of, like, what's right. Should we follow this kind of right or that kind of right? That confliction, like, should other people learn that lesson through a different medium, sort of just to diversify it?
Well, I think books aren't necessarily, a book can be brought up in sort of like the agenda of an English curriculum, but it could be brought up to like teach a lesson and bring sort of a moral out of the story. But I don't think that's exclusively the purpose. I think it's primarily to appreciate the prose, to appreciate the literature, and if someone gets a lesson from that, then so be it. But it's interesting that you take the angle of, like, should people like try to take that lesson away from a different medium, and if it only works, if that book will only give that lesson to a certain person, and I think so I guess my response is that, like, yes, I think a book might teach a lesson for one person and not another, but I don't think if that person doesn't draw a lesson from that book, that they need to go seek out that lesson somewhere else, unless it's what they're interested in, because I don't think that's the primary purpose of the book. I think if they appreciate it or they don't, and they just take it as it is, then that's the book has served its purpose. The author's done their job.
Yeah, and I think that your comment about how people learn a lesson from a book, well, a teacher's kind of gaze and perspective can definitely shape that and fashion how it's consumed, as like morality or rules or what you should and shouldn't do, good and evil. I think that we were going to talk about the diving bell and the butterfly, and my favorite quote from the book reads, "I'm fading away, slowly but surely, like the sailor who watches his home shore gradually disappear. I watch my past recede. My old life still burns within me, but more and more of it is reduced to ashes of memory." And that quote offers either a very sad reading or a very almost, I would say, content. There's something cathartic about it, because he's in this purgatory where he is alive, but he feels like he's just burning into his own memories. And I think that can be very differently consumed by someone who has maybe experienced death in their family by a loved one or a close one, and someone who hasn't really come face to face with loss, because reading this short, like, fading away and disappearing in front of his eyes is kind of reflecting and symbolizing the loss of life in his own life. So someone who fears death, or someone who doesn't understand death, would understand and consume that quote very differently. So I think that while the same lesson could could be learned. I don't think that just by reading the same book from the same teacher at the same time, that the same lesson will be taught.
Yeah, I think, well, just one thing I want to say there. I think, so the point that I was making earlier wasn't about necessarily an individual lesson or moral, but it was about sort of the experience, and that, I think, the way I sort of view books is, or I read them is that I get a window into the experience of a character, whether that character is made up or not. So I think, you're right that you can draw a different lesson. You can come away with a different feeling, and it can affect your life in very different ways. But I do think that, um, that what a story can give you is that insight into a character's life. And I do think that is, I'm not sure actually whether or not that is sort of a cookie cutter, like exactly the same for every person, because the book is exactly the same, but
Right.
it can be read in so many different ways. So I think, I agree with you that, it's very individual.
And I think that if we should address another topic that is related to it, and that's author representation and racial, socioeconomic, gender representation in the literature we read, because often we're going to not only find white writers, white authors, white male authors, but we're going to find white male characters that are protagonists and lead and push a story. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about how the next generation can make improvements in the books they have, middle schoolers and high schoolers read, or if you think that because white men had the most opportunity to produce art and to write back in the 1950s, 60s, and much earlier as well, that representation and that kind of skewed amount of the literature that we're reading being white male authors is somewhat justifiable, which I personally don't believe, but I'm not sure if you have thoughts on that.
Well, I have one quick thought on that. Yeah. I think, Beethoven will always be classical. Beethoven is classical music, and I don't think that that's ever going to change. So I think, similarly, a lot of authors are very entrenched in their classic, classics standard, their, sort of badge. So I think that that might be a problem. Eventually, that it's going to be really hard to cycle through, newly created classics. And I think that, I do think that there's a worry there, that we should remember that new stuff is being written all the time, and we shouldn't just read, and emphasis being on just read the classics of Shakespeare or, Steinbeck or something like that.
Right.
But yeah.
I have a question before I forget and we branch too far away. Since you were talking about how the book is the same cookie cutter, but it can be, people might take it differently. I was going to ask earlier about, since we sort of walked away from the difference between a book and then the film that adapts the film from which the film that's a copy of that book. Jesus. We'll edit that out. So my question is, not a question. I just want to bring up that, like, the book, the book is always the same, as you said, when unless there's like multiple copies written, the text will always be the same. But one of the ways in which the reader can take it differently is how they imagine the world the author tries to paint for them through words. And so I guess one of the questions I wanted to bring up when comparing the value of just the original book to a film adaptation of that is, when you put that text into a movie, you're having this imaginative world laid out in front of you in one image. It's like that's concrete now. And each person's going to imagine the world differently when they're only reading the text, because the author can try to describe it as best they can. But to a degree, each reader is going to imagine it in their own way. And I guess my question is, which do you think is more valuable, to be able to read about this world being described in front of you and imagine it for yourself, or to see it very clearly laid out for you in a movie by CGI or whatever?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think, well, I mean, without getting too deep into the sort of the philosophical question of, can we know what other people experience, and can we make it the same for everyone? It's just sort of a fact that everyone experiences things differently. And so I think, I don't know. So when I was I had an English teacher a couple of years ago who really opened my eyes, because in middle school we read a lot of sort of Emily Dickinson poems and things like that, and I was always very concerned with figuring out the puzzle of the language and finding out the meaning, the singular meaning, and that was always, very kind of stressful for me. So when a couple of years ago I had a teacher tell me that he just stood back for a second and said, remember guys, like, that what's so freeing about literature is that we can completely remove the author from our experience of the literature, of
Right.
the work, of the novel. So I think, and that was just really, that blew my mind, because I think, especially when you have you really use your imagination when you read a book, especially with a character, with a person, and you imagine what a person is like, and you get a picture of them in your head, and you really try to empathize with them. And it was very freeing to me, at least, that it's not that I'm trying to figure out what character the author was trying to make, or that character is who I imagine in my head. And who I sort of imagine going through the story that I'm reading. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember.
So I guess, so you think it's fair to say that you would prefer to have the freedom, the liberty to imagine the characters your own way, or imagine the world your own way, rather than having it just like put in front of you on a screen? Because,
well, I mean, I'm more saying that it's going to happen whether or not, like it's sort of out of my control almost. Like,
sure.
Like even if it's actually sometimes bothers me when books have like too much detail,
Yeah.
Like it sometimes, if there's too much detail in a book, it can actually make it harder to visualize. Especially with like physical places, especially with landscapes or a room. Like, there's in a lot of books, there's like when, I walked into the room and there was a clock and like 7 shirts on the bed and 3 windows and that, this and that, and very in-depth description, and that really draws away from the story and the imagination that you can put into it. So
you would agree that that's walking a very thin line, like with creating a story with intention, detail, and specificity is required almost to like make emotional statements, to spread a message, to teach a lesson. Creating subjectivity and imagery is very different than subjectivity and storytelling. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah, but the one thing I would disagree with, though, is that it's necessary. I definitely think that you can, like, I think it can add to depth, whatever that is. But I don't think that it is an absolute necessity for the conveyance of an emotion or a story.
Yeah, I do agree.
So, let's move on. How about, speaking of characters and putting yourself in their shoes, can we just talk about Catcher in the Rye for a minute? Catcher in the Rye, great book. So say some people. Before I put in my 2 cents, I just want to hear what you guys have to say about it.
Well, I for one have not read this book, unfortunately, so I won't have much to contribute. But Samuel.
Okay.
So I think that Catcher in the Rye is interesting. I know that you personally don't like it, Harold, and I also don't like the word interesting. So I'm going to say riveting instead, because you create a relationship with oh God, Oh Lord, what's his name?
Oh boy.
Oh, Holden
Holden
Caulfield.
Caulfield, yeah.
Holden Caulfield. And he's an outcast. He's odd. His throughout the entire book, he doesn't really change. There's not much of a character arc, I would say. He starts off calling people phony. He ends calling people phony, and it's more just observing how he perceives the world and how he addresses it with his own, insecurities, flaws, confusion. And it's definitely a question. The theme of adolescence comes in and isolation, which.
Sorry, I don't know that, but I do have a skill you might like. It's called The Song That Never Ends.
One moment. Forgive my Alexa is, we have a really rough relationship. Yeah.
That sounded like Siri.
Please turn off Alexa.
Hey.
Okay, we're good now.
Alexa can talk about books.
I wanted to talk about how we often see isolation and now I'm losing my train of thought. Isolation and adolescence in tandem. And throughout Catcher in the Rye, that isolation is reduced because we have such a close relationship with our narrator. And I think a lot of people find Holden kind of, not disarming, he's uncomfortable to be around throughout the book. And we see him call people fake. He doesn't like the world. Everything's wrong. And him not receiving and not accepting the world makes us not accept him. And I think that why you may not like the book, Harold, is because Holden alienates you from his own story. And that's what makes it kind of this particular aspect of storytelling where we're really just, I'm not even sure if you would call it narrative, because you're just looking at Holden and how he looks at the world. There's not much of an arc for anything. And I think that you may find that not only boring, but kind of alienating. You don't feel incorporated into the story, and therefore you don't really find it entertaining. But that's just my approach to the novel.
Well, I think a couple of things. I think entertaining is an interesting word there, because I did think at the time that I read it, and I do think now that it's an incredibly well written book. I think that my biggest problem is with Holden Caulfield, the character, honestly. I just remember I should probably read it again to make sure that I can justify these claims of mine. But I just remember this one scene very vividly that seemed at the time to be the epitome of Holden as a character. Nearing the very end of the book, I think he sees an expletive written on the wall, and he takes it as a personal slight against him. That oh no, the world is messed up. That's it. Oh, how terrible. Oh, the agony. And I just and I was really sort of repulsed by that. That it's just so hard to it's also just really hard to relate to a character who's in so many ways so fortunate, who spends the entire book trying is a bit more active, I suppose, but I felt like he was really trying to make me sympathetic to him, and it was just so hard to be sympathetic with him. And I think to be fair, I think another big reason that I really dislike it is because of how many people really do like it. And I think, and I also think, so I think that my problem is also less with the book and more with the implications for other people. Because as I've actually said this a number of times, that I'm very suspicious of people who say that one of their favorite characters of all time is Holden Caulfield, because what that makes me think is, oh, you're a person who is very privileged, who thinks that they're really not.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's too close-minded of me, and maybe I should be more open-minded. But and again, I should really read it again recently, soon, so that I can so that I'm not too judgmental. But I think I also think that we just read, this past semester I read another book by J.D. Salinger, which I did actually really like, called Franny and Zooey, and I think that because Matthew hasn't read Catcher in the Rye, that would be a good segue into something he could talk about. So what did you think about the characters in Franny and Zooey, Matthew?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is I thought the most striking thing in Franny and Zooey, just off the bat, is the fact that there's a big transition from the book primarily being between Franny and I cannot remember her boyfriend's name, right? Her boyfriend is the first part of the book, and it sure seems like that's going to be the bulk, the main source of the storyline. And then it's just a total transition away from that, and it becomes focused on the family, and it becomes mostly between Franny and Zooey, the brother and sister. So I found Franny to be the most compelling character. Well, complicated. I found Zooey most compelling because his approach to dealing with Franny's difficulties was sort of, I think, the really, you know, the best, my favorite moment of the story anyway, I'll say, where he sort of calms her down as she's having this existential crisis with the fat lady story. Anyway, I guess I'm sort of just, you know, spitting out random thoughts about the characters, but do we have like a specific character we want to talk about, or a specific quality in the characters we want to discuss?
Well, I mean, I can say a couple things. I think I did really like Franny and Zooey.
Yeah.
I definitely wouldn't say it was my favorite book, but I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected to, especially going into it really disliking the only other book I'd read by the same author. And so I was suspicious of these characters because I expected them to be very similar to Holden Caulfield. And in many ways they were, you know. There were a couple offhand comments near the beginning about, like, actually, especially way at the very beginning, there's one girl who gets off the train with Franny, and who was on the train with Franny, who's wearing like tutu or like some, and like ballet shoes or something like that, and Franny's like this description of her is so disparaging, and then she's like, oh, she's probably some Sarah Lawrence girl, and
Right.
that, well, firstly, my sister went to Sarah Lawrence, so I thought that was kind of funny, but and then there were a couple comments later on about how everyone was getting taxis to the Yale game. So I mean, it's definitely I think it was sort of, it was weird for me that insight into that kind of society seemed to neglect like so many people.
Sure.
And I don't want to invalidate, you know, the characters' lives and their stories, but maybe I'm just, you know, not quite smart enough to see that Salinger like added those pieces on purpose to give you sort of a conflicted sense of these characters. But no, it sort of brushed me the wrong way. Is that the phrase? Rubbed me the wrong way.
Sort of the stereotypes about people coming from certain colleges at the beginning.
Well, I mean, it wasn't just colleges specifically, but it's also, I mean, I also think there was a bit of having his cake and eating it too, that like these characters come from, you know, very well off, very privileged society, and then they also, and then a large part of the story is Franny's existential crisis with you know, conforming to the society, and and especially when they're at the restaurant with the frog's legs, and like that felt to me like it was really there to illustrate how ridiculous, you know, high society was. Like, I think it was expected to like frog legs.
Right. I think it was a commentary on the degree to which there were all these cliques within that society, from people from certain schools. And her crisis is that she struggles to conform to those, that she doesn't want to necessarily be a part of one group. She just want to, you know, slap a label on herself. While as her boyfriend is all about that superficial appearance of trying to just be a part of those groups of people and conform to those behaviors and be have that perfect appearance, even in the restaurant with how they're sitting, how they're carrying out conversations. So when she breaks down, you know, that's a problem for him because she's not acting like the perfect girlfriend.
I also think that high society comes up a lot in the literature we read, but I can't really think of an example where it is idealized or, you know, put in this frame where it's what you want to obtain. It's the end goal. It's the American dream. And I think it's often used ironically, for example, in The Great Gatsby, and even in Romeo and Juliet, you could say that high society is, you know, criticized, and it's not presented to the reader as something that they should want to attain or need. And I think that that's interesting that it often reoccurs in the literature we read in our younger years as something almost to avoid, or at least nothing to, shoot towards.
Well, I think an author would be heavily criticized if they published a work where they were praising the high society.
No. It's storytelling. So
Sure.
it wouldn't matter. I
Sure.
just think that regardless, and even like when it is used, it's used ironically, which is, if anything, it's more, this like biting cynicism. It's a jibe. It's an attack, which would be just as dangerous as, attacking the lower class for an author, especially in the 1970s, 1980s. Your audience is rich white people.
I think that that's actually important to note, because I think maybe part of what I reacted to in Catcher in the Rye and Franny and Zoe is sort of, I think I got too much of a sense that this kind of high society was something to strive for, but it was, it wasn't just wealth. It was, I also thought that there was a lot of sort of intellectual superiority and highness, especially with like the how the entire family was on a radio show for being geniuses, and I think, but then again, I don't know, it's kind of weird though, because part of, as I was saying earlier, maybe I'm just not smart enough to see that these pieces are cleverly added to add depth to these characters and sort of a conflicted sense for the reader, because maybe it's supposed to be made harder for me as a reader to empathize with these characters. Maybe that was an intentional move, but I mean, at some point, I don't know, it's just, it becomes a very difficult task.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that another topic that actually you could move out of socioeconomic status and the 1% and wealth is toxic masculinity, which really isn't addressed in early literature or even, early modern literature. And I think that, well, actually, why don't we do this? Why don't we take our break now? And then we'll open up with toxic masculinity in the latter half, part 2 of books we read in high school. The episode.
And gender and sexuality in general, I'd say.
Yes.
All right. So
Sounds good.
That concludes part 1. Hope to see you back for part 2.
Thank you for coming, everybody.